Hello and welcome to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. This is episode 37 of the weekly Story Savvy series, where we tackle the 52 biggest self-editing topics and tips to help you make your good story great, as an aspiring author asks me, a developmental editor, all of the questions that you have wanted to. We have covered a bunch in this series so far, including last week's episode on scene level pacing for big and small moments. Today, we are going to take a look at handling jumps in time, location, POV, or narrative focal length in fiction. By the end of this episode, you'll hopefully know where to catch these potential glitches, what makes for a good transition, and how to fix one that's jarring. Joining me to ask all of the questions is my friend and co-host Agnes Wolfe. Welcome.
Hi, I'm an aspiring fantasy author who hopes to release her first middle grade fantasy later next year, and also host and founder of Authors Alcove. I'm here today to tackle easing and clarifying the reader experience around transition, especially scene breaks and chapter breaks. And that's right where I am in my own self-editing, so I'm kind of excited to cover this.
Excellent.
I would like to start with some of the most basic things that we should keep in mind when we are dealing with handling jumps in time, place, point of view, and focal length. How soon should we let our reader know that the story has taken one of these jumps, and how should we accomplish that?
First of all, you want to let them know immediately. And ideally, use a chapter break or a scene break where you have one of these jumps. The basics here are that you always need to be extremely clear when the story has jumped forward or changed in any of these other ways, and set the reader up to know exactly where, when, and who is the reality of the other side of that jump, and to do so immediately. So don't make your reader end up, reeling from whiplash or getting confused or mentally, groping around this blank, empty, unknown space or POV for a while after you jump, be that starting a new scene or a new chapter, anything like that. You never want to just teleport the reader into an unknown time and place or perspective. Um, and and you have to remember that the reader is just reading one word in front of the other. They don't know what's coming yet, which you as the author often do.
Speaking of which, us writers, since we do know what's happening, we often are blind to the issues here, since we know what we meant and we have a visual of things which the reader does not have. How can we be sure that our reader has made that jump with us and it didn't just happen in our head because we knew that was supposed to happen?
So there's a checklist that I suggest you go through and you check the beginning of every new chapter and every new scene anywhere it's applicable. So step one is, or question one, I should say, is is it clear who is the POV character of that scene? Is it clear who the primary protagonist of this scene is, if there are options for who that might be? Is it clear who does or says the first thing that is done or said in this new moment? Is it clear who is present on stage, so to speak? And this can be more of a general, like, hey, is this a private setting or is this a public one where anyone might wander over at some point? And this is to avoid a new character, secondary character, sort of magically teleporting in the first time that they speak or have something to do when they weren't previously mentioned as being there. The next question is it clear how much time has passed since the last line of the last moment or scene or chapter before the break or the jump? And if that's not natural to say right there, can you place this new moment in the grander timeline? Can you say, oh, it's this many weeks since this memorable event, or this many weeks to this other event that we've been counting down to through the whole book? Next question is it clear where things are in the moment that we pick back up, specifically or generally? So are we in a castle? Are we in a bedroom? Are we outside? Are we in a forest? Giving some sense of place is important. And then the last question on this checklist is all of these things clear in the first paragraph, ideally the first sentence after the break? For example, a good transition line after a break might be something like Jordan angrily stabbed at their breakfast, glowering at Alex across the loud mess hall. That tells the reader that we are in Alex's scene, that it is the morning after the last whatever, that we are in a mess hall, that Alex is also present, and that there are lots of other people also present who can later be defined as they approach or join into what's happening without it feeling like they're appearing out of nowhere. If you are doing omniscient POV, also known as head hopping as a consistent and intentional choice, then each place the story hops from one head to another should be treated very delicately and gently, like the kind of break that we are talking about here. And if nothing else, with these tiny, very, very frequent breaks, you need to make sure that it's always clear which head you are in after each hop. You need to be clear whose head you are hopping into with each internal observation or opinion or emotion, anything like that.
And one of the things that I was kind of thinking about is, so I just took 5 chapters and made them two. And
Nice.
one of the things that I found when in my self editing is that I had already introduced this person, I had already done this, but when I condensed it, I had to go, when I went and read, I'm like, oh, I have to reintroduce that. And I think that in our self editing, that's probably one of the huge mistakes.
Sure.
Speaking of mistakes, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see writers make as a development editor?
So specifically on today's topic of handling these jumps and transitions, there are a few that very easily jump to mind, and I see these a lot in a lot of the books that I work on. Number one is not using scene breaks at all where a big jump is taken. When you skip ahead overnight or from one day to another or across weeks or the other end of a journey, you need to use at least a scene break. Mistake two, well, okay, so hold on. On that first one, I want to clarify just a little bit more on that. It's squishy. How much of a skip needs a scene break and how much doesn't? Generally, if you're skipping minutes or hours, you don't need a scene break if you mention, oh, this much time has been skipped, we're continuing the story. If it's more than that. You probably need a scene break. And if you don't want to use one of the most important tools there is to make sure that you name the transition that happened to skip ahead to the end of the meal or whatever, rather than just jumping to the far side of that gap. So then issue number two that I see very frequently is that basically it's not clear whose POV things are in, particularly in dual POV or multiple POV. When you start a new chapter, some people will just put the name as a subheading to the chapter, and that's great. That clarifies it. You don't have to do that, but it does need to be clear immediately if there are multiple POV characters in the book, which one it is for that scene. And then the third common mistake that I will often see around these transitions is just provide a lack of context against the last scene. So if the last scene closed in a certain time and place, when you open the next one, you need to make it clear that it's not that time and or not that place anymore, because without establishing that, the reader is going to have to assume that it is picking up right where the last one left off, and that's rarely the case.
So I know that there are words that we should use, but as far as like structurally, are there certain rules surrounding jumps in time or place, such as scene breaks, chapter breaks, or white space?
Is that what you mean by saying there are words to use, or are you just talking about definitions there?
No, I'm talking about like structurally, like um, do we, is there rules about like the white space that we should
Sure.
be using?
Sure. So, first of all, Whitespace is not a replacement for a scene break or a chapter break, and it should be used very sparingly, only where you're jumping too little time for it to really qualify to have a full scene break there. Chapter breaks and scene breaks are pretty interchangeable. In particular, chapter breaks are an arbitrary choice by the author, but are most commonly seen where you move on from everything that is clustered around one scene core event to the next or to another one. A scene break can be used within a chapter, and it is most often used to skip boring stuff that the reader doesn't need to see, like I was talking about. Use that to skip to the end of a meal, overnight, couple of days ahead, whatever you want to do, that's still keeping the narrative around whatever the core event for that chapter is. And then you can also use a scene break within a chapter to change from one POV to another, which I think we'll touch on a little bit more later in this episode. The only rules per se that I can think of to mention right here are number one, make sure that you name and or number your chapters. It doesn't matter which one you want to go with, you can do both, but please use something like chapter one or, you know, introductions as a title for the chapter, something like that. Rule number two is use three asterisks center aligned as a scene break. It has to be some sort of symbol, or I've seen very decorative ones. It's a bit a piece of art, but that's not expected before publication. Use some visual marker for your scene breaks. Rule three is don't use white space breaks unless you have standard formatting for everything else. If you have blank lines, so white space, between just ordinary paragraphs going through the narrative, then trying to use white space extra to differentiate that sort of gap isn't going to be visually catchable and it's not going to work well. So avoid extra blank lines between your paragraphs, especially if you want to be using white space as a break at any point. Rule four is use some sort of marked break anywhere that the story takes a big jump in time, location, POV, anything like that. No exceptions. There has to be some sort of marked break, be that a chapter break, scene break, or white space. And then point number five, rule number five here is check the transitions around all three possible break types that I just listed for issues of reestablishing the where, when, and who or whose. Again, no exceptions.
So when doing transitions from one place time to another, how can we make sure that what we write is smooth and doesn't seem jarring or out of place to our reader? I know our goal is that our transitions should feel seamless and visible so that the reader just comes along with us and doesn't even realize that, oh, yes, this is a scene break.
Yeah, so there are different ways to approach this. A couple of the easy ones are you can either state in the opening, well, so many time units later. So 3 days later, a week later, 2 months later, whatever. Or more ideally than that, if you want to up your craft a little bit, you can try showing that kind of thing. Like mentioning after breakfast in the opening line, which shows the reader, I should say, that a night has passed without having to state the next morning. Or, as another example here, if you establish how long an upcoming journey is going to take before your characters set out on it, then if you end the chapter and you start the next one of them walking through the gates of this new city, for example, that's all you need to do. You told the reader exactly how many days it was going to take. So just by showing that they have arrived, you have handled that jump forward in time and location, and that's all you need to do.
How can we make sure that our story doesn't lose momentum when transitioning time and space?
Don't do breaks too often. The rule of thumb that I tend to use and suggest around that is that if you can't get at least 1,000 words of the story happening in real time altogether before you need to do a jump, be that in time, location, or POV, you need to reassess how you have events or conversations grouped within your narrative. If in order to move forward, you need to constantly use chapter breaks, scene breaks, white space, shifts, and POV, and they're all these little tiny, 200, 500, 700 word snippets, that's not working. You need to instead combine events into one day that you can show happening coherently, or you need to gather up 5 or 6 conversations and put them into one longer conversation so that you don't have to do these jumps too frequently. Also, though, on the other side of that, you don't want to avoid using scene breaks where they are needed. So within that lower constraint, use them liberally enough to leave every scene as early as possible and arrive at the next one as late as possible. So if you have a bloated chapter, look for a place where you could shave off a few paragraphs up to a few pages by using a scene break to skip over the boring stuff in the chapter and instead end the first scene of the chapter earlier and start the next one later by using that break to spare the reader stuff that they don't really need to read in detail. Beyond that, confusion is just a huge momentum killer. So clarifying when, where, and who the scene or chapter is opening with will help keep momentum up and let the reader stay fully in the story.
So we've brought up this phrase or this idea a few times, and I just want to make sure there's a clear definition of what we're talking about. But what is focal length, which you've mentioned earlier?
Focal length is how close to events the narration is, and or whether or not things are unfolding in real time. For example, close focal length would be things like dialogue, emotions or expressions, detailed actions, and that sort of thing. Distant focal length is describing a large backdrop before narrowing in to the story unfolding. It is using summary statements like they traveled for several days. It could be providing backstory overviews in narration and other things like those. This topic here of focal length is the outlier in this set, since you don't really need to check that your focal distance is clear about whether or not it's close or distant after each break. But it can be used to zoom in or out and help you avoid needing to use a break at all. If instead of using a break, be that white space, scene break, chapter break, you instead decide to just zoom out and say something like they traveled for several days, that zoom out can spare you needing to use a break that you would then need to ease the transition of. Choosing to zoom out for transitions with or without a break there can be a good choice depending on specific instances. It's not universally applicable. And really importantly, you should only ever be using really distant or zoomed out focal length for transitions of some kind. You never want to be zooming out that focal length in an important ongoing moment, like we talked about a little bit in the last episode in this series. Lastly, on this point, you need to actively move that transition in focal length at least a little bit in either direction, no matter where you are doing it. I don't think I phrased that clearly, so let me try to clarify here. If you are moving from, let's say, dialogue, where everything is happening in real time, you don't want to then in the next paragraph just whammy it over into over the next 3 months, they blah, blah, blah. That's going to be a little bit jarring. So spare a sentence here or there to sort of make that more of a zoom. Go from that dialogue to, well, and then they, gathered up their belongings and they moved towards the horses, and then you can get to that super zoomed out. Or if you're coming into a new scene or a chapter or even a full book, when you're describing, oh, Calanthra is a land of plenty, and these grand jungles cover most of these continents. You can't immediately then jump down into so and so said this. That's going to be very, very jarring. You need to again look at this planet, however big, however zoomed out you're starting, and zoom it in kind of stage by stage so that you aren't leaping straight from either 20,000 foot view or real time into the other.
That makes a lot of sense. And my next question, I feel like we've already covered this, but I just want to make sure that we're covering all our bases. But when we do passage of time, for instance, like when should we summarize? You've kind of covered what happened over the passage of time, and when should we write it all out? You've kind of covered that as well. But are there any other rules about summarizing that we have not yet discussed?
Yeah, so summarizing can be seen as handling a passage in time, but it is also very much zooming out that focal length like we were just talking about. To answer your question about how to make a call about whether to summarize something or not to, the question to ask yourself is essentially, how boring is it? If the reader needs the details, or if those details are particularly interesting, write them out in real time. If not, then like if it's just wrap up from one thing or setting something else up or a transition of any kind to get just to the next part of the story, then that is more likely a good place for things to be summarized. So if your protagonist is arriving at the mountain where they know they will be fighting their final battle, that probably has a lot of emotion and adrenaline and preparation detail worth describing in real time. However, the process of them just walking for 6 days to get there can probably be a scene or chapter break where you are fully skipping that boringness. But then if, let's say, they sit by their fire and meditate all night to prepare for the battle, that might be a good place to simply zoom out, summarize it in a statement like they meditated all night in preparation for the battle, and then zoom back in once that real-time interest comes back up the next morning. More generally on the topic of summarizing, using that to briefly catch up the reader on what got skipped since the last scene, ideally in the first or second paragraph of the new one, is very often exactly the right choice for that moment and for what you need to do for the reader there. Anywhere else, anywhere that isn't a transition, particularly a scene break or a chapter break, it is more likely to feel off to the reader if you're summarizing. It's more likely to feel like you are lazy and you didn't want to fill out what was actually happening there, or you never really made a decision, or like you're withholding interest from them, and none of that is good. When you choose to not use a break, so if you want to just use white space or not even white space to handle a jump, that zoom out, summarize, and zoom back in is absolutely what you can do there. So, for example, you could say, Sarah walked to town, and that summarizing can bridge that gap, just like if you showed her preparing to leave and then used a break and then showed her arriving in town. As long as she's not magically appearing there with no markers, you're doing okay.
So I kind of, this kind of goes along with what we've been talking about, but like I feel like consistency is important in writing. Like I think of like books that have like transition from one person to another really well. But I think especially in jumping from past to present, books that go back and forth or have multiple different timelines,
Mhm.
that preparing the reader by having a certain setup is so key. So, are there certain rules surrounding these aspects that we should consider if we are jumping timelines or POV even?
Sure. So first of all, yes, the Night Court is absolutely like my favorite book that handles multiple timelines well. So if anyone needs an example, I recommend that. There are a few rules here to really, really help with multiple timelines. First, if you remotely can, try to do a direct 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 alternation between the two timelines without breaking that pattern. Like you were just mentioning, establishing for the reader that they can have these expectations and it will continue to be fulfilled is very, very helpful. Second, embed as many hints as you can in every scene about which age or timeline or what have you that is happening in, be that through the technology or the clothing, the government, anything like that. And third, keep the POVs and settings very distinct between all of your different timelines. Have, for example, one of them be an innocent viewpoint, somewhere bright and hot, and then the other timeline be a jaded personality, somewhere that is dark and damp. That way, you have a pretty much inexhaustible variety in ways to signal that transition in just a couple of words. For example, even with first person narration, by opening after a chapter break or a scene break with something like, I squinted into the sun wondering, blah, 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 is very indicative of one personality. And then you can contrast that with opening a scene with something like, I frowned and turned my collar up against the depressing damp. Without naming a character, without naming a location or a timeline, both of those, if you've established them or are going to, are clear. The fact that it's sunny tells the reader, oh, it's in that timeline. The fact that this person is frowning and generally negative tells you that you're in the other one. But also, more generally, on the topic of consistency, I'm really glad that you brought that up here. Being consistent and establishing your own predictable patterns around person, tense, and POV can be very, very important to the reader's perception of it. In my own books, or at least the more recent ones, I try to have the POV character for that scene's name be the first word the reader sees on that page. And for another example, if you want to use scene breaks to swap POVs within one chapter at any point in the story, it helps that not feel jarring if you also do that same multiple POVs in a chapter early on in the story and then consistently throughout.
You mentioned that we should not teleport our reader, but what if we're purposely trying to teleport our reader? Like we actually have teleporting in ours. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about fantasy or time
Sure.
travel or something to that. Like, how do we handle that since we aren't supposed to accidentally do that?
There's a difference between teleporting your reader and teleporting your characters. So there can be overlap in how you want to look at this. You never want to teleport your reader as in they don't have any explanation for why they are now in a different POV time place, anything like that. When you're teleporting a character, because your world actually has teleportation of some description, all you really have to do is name that. And this can be with whatever terms you want to come up with for your world building. Voyaging, winnowing, apparition, anything like that can work. Just establish what that word means. And then you still want to go through your checklist of establishing the when, where, and who on the far side of that transition after every literal teleport or time jump or what have you.
Well, thank you so much for your insight. It has always helped me, especially because I feel like we are talking through the portions that I am self-editing at the moment, which is always nice. Thank you.
Perfect. Absolutely. Next week, we are going to go deep into dialing up the uniqueness in fiction at the scene and page levels specifically. For now, I will thank everyone who follows along with this series. If you know any other authors who are nearing the end of their first draft or struggling with revising or rewriting their novel, please send them our way. The more authors that we can help understand and finish the process of self-editing, the happier I will be. Thank you again.
Thank you. Can't wait to see you next week.
Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make your good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more, or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.